Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Smells Like Business, where you can learn more about the current and future state of cannabis, CBD, and hemp in Europe. Every episode we talk to different cannabis experts and entrepreneurs, making it easier for you to understand the cannabis industry. Hi Ben, how are you doing? Welcome to the Smells Like Business show.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks very much for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. I mean, I saw your article on BusinessCann about JuicyFields, and I was like, yep, I got to get this guy on the show. It's obviously the hot topic that's going around at the moment. I was at the ICBC in Berlin a couple weeks ago, and I think they were one of their sponsors, but no longer. I did not see any JuicyFields signs about, so, but it was definitely being discussed a lot in the industry. So I'm looking forward to picking your brain a little bit there.
Yeah, as far as I know, JuicyFields was meant to be the big sponsor for them, and
many others.
Pretty much every other big European, and I think even some North American things, and that's a large part of it. But I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Yeah, we'll come on. I think even in Durban, in South Africa, there was a cannabis event there as well. Great. So, I mean, I usually like to start the show by finding out a little bit about my guests. So I was thinking maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, paint us a little picture, and how what you were doing before you actually entered the cannabis industry.
Sure. So I am fairly new to the cannabis industry. I joined BusinessCann in October last year, and it's been a kind of baptism by fire since then. But it's a very fast-moving industry, as I'm sure you're aware. But fascinating all the more, and everybody is super friendly and very keen to tell you about their business and what's going on in the sector, and everybody's kind of working towards the same goal. So it makes life a lot easier for journalists that everybody's willing to speak to you. Before that, I was working in retail journalism, strangely enough, a job I kind of fell into for around 5 years, kind of covering business sectors, which is really why I kind of had a big interest in the cannabis sector, certainly from the business side. CBD is a big part, medical cannabis is obviously a big part, but there was a lot of crossover. So that was the kind of lead into it. But, the motivation was just that, I know from personal experience and friends of friends and family members just how much difference it can make to people's lives, whether medical cannabis or just CBD. I think it makes a lot of difference day to day, writing about and working in an industry that you actually care about and that is making a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, being kind of nascent still in Europe, or very much in its infancy, at least, certain sectors for sure, makes it very exciting as well. But yeah, of course, there's the recreational side of it, of course, is nice. And, you can make comparisons to alcohol and maybe it's better, it's probably better. And all these arguments you may have. But like I said, when you're talking about medical cannabis and also hemp, all the industrial applications of hemp, I mean, you could go on for hours and hours, days, years, just on that. So definitely an exciting industry to be part of. I see also you got a few instruments behind you. I'm also a drummer back in the day. And I feel there's quite a few musicians in this industry. I mean, it kind of goes hand in hand a little bit. Yeah. Great. So, I mean, let's talk a bit about BusinessCann. So you said you joined them last October, right? So, I mean, yes. So what is BusinessCann? What is it you guys do? And what's your role in the company?
So I am currently editor of BusinessCann. So
Chief editor or?
So we have another chief editor, Peter, but he is currently on a sabbatical, coming back to 1 day a week. So I'm kind of running a show there at the moment. It's BusinessCann is how it was described to me when I was joining is kind of the Financial Times of the cannabis industry. So we focus specifically on the European cannabis sector and try and cover as much of it as possible, although we take a kind of UK veered focus as we're sort of based here. In that there are so many publications which don't focus specifically on the B2B side of things. They focus more on either the medical side and a lot of the kind of implications of medical research and things, which obviously comes into our writing a lot, but we're really focused more on the kind of investment case the real sort of nitty gritty numbers, and put a lot of emphasis on making sure everything is very well researched and corroborated, and as kind of
reliable.
As journalistically has as much journalistic integrity. There we go. As possible, which I think in kind of new sectors, especially exciting ones, and especially ones like cannabis, which kind of has always had that, I think, historic segment where there is a lot of hyperbole and a lot of excitement that it's getting so big, but it's not often, that reliable a source of information. So that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And I guess also because the industry is so new, it's just hard to find sources, right? There just isn't that much has been written on, on the industry. And especially from a business perspective, like I talked to quite a lot of people in the field, and there are different cannabis media outlets. I just the other week I had Ilana Goldberg, who's the CEO of the Canigma. I don't know if you know it. They're quite big, but she's saying, we cover quite a lot, but we don't have business in our wheelhouse. You guys do, and I've noticed that's lacking a little bit. So it's good to. There's people and sources like yourself that's covering that aspect as well. So, and of course, we're called Smells Like Business. That's the name of our company, our podcast. So I'm very much a pro. Great. So, what are some of the topics you've covered recently? Maybe you can give us some examples. I know I saw the latest one. I don't know if it's the latest one, but one of your latest topics on LeafWire. I had the pleasure of having Peter Fogel on the show as well and managed to pick his brain. And I read that article. That was very interesting. So I know that you're sort of collaborating with him and Prohibition Partners. But what are some maybe you can give us a couple examples of what people can expect coming to your website.
Sure. So I recently, really, what we've been focused on is the very fast-moving developments in regulation across a lot of Europe. So Spain, Italy, Switzerland, very recent ones. Lots of, even Ukraine, which is one no one expected, is kind of working to liberalize medical cannabis, if not legalize it. And so, digging quite deep into exactly what this means. There's so much confusion in the mainstream media about liberalization of laws, legalizing medical cannabis, and a lot of countries have historic medical cannabis schemes that still have massive barriers to access. That was kind of the situation with Switzerland, and these developments just make that easier. But the headline is they've legalized cannabis and everybody gets confused. So digging quite deep into exactly what this means for patients, exactly what it means for consumers, what it means for businesses. We cover a lot of kind of international trade in terms of everybody has quite stringent and unique laws surrounding medical cannabis, and certainly from the investment perspective, for instance, in the UK, investing is very difficult because of the Proceeds of Crime Act. You have to prove that anything you invest in is legal in the UK, even if it's if it's legal in the US, for instance, if it's recreational and you invest in a company, that would be considered illegal here, even though it's legal there. So trying to cover all this, we do a lot of work on the CBD industry, as the UK is kind of the leader in terms of regulation in that pretty much in the world. At least we're trying to be. It's very complicated and a bit of a mess, but there's a lot of interesting movement there, and that's a whole kind of unique side of that. And a lot to do with stocks, how stocks are performing across Europe. There's a lot of coverage of that in the US because so many of these companies have had big bubbles, kind of taken off, got massive market caps, and have now underperformed. But there's not quite that sort of confined, focused source of that in the EU. So that's what we try to focus on as well. Look at investment.
Sorry to butt in. Didn't you do a recent article also about the stock in Israel as well?
Yes. So I can't take credit for that. That was today's one, which was from the Israeli Cannabis magazine, I think. So they're a great source for Israel, big shout out to them, and we work with them for some of our reports as well. But yes, so the kind of ongoing, certainly this year, underperformance of cannabis stocks, why that is, what the barriers are to investment, and what needs to be done for these companies, which, on paper, while they're early, have a fairly good investment case, and why they are underperforming compared to their contemporaries in, say, the wellness industries or other pharmaceutical companies, which don't have cannabis relations. So yeah, it, as you mentioned, it's such a nascent early industry that there is so many rapid developments, and there is so much to play for. I think the one theme in this industry is when, not if. Everybody knows it's going to happen. Everyone knows it's going to be massive. It's just trying to chronicle that journey in as much reliable detail as possible.
The devil's in the details, right? And so it's the devil's lettuce as well. So I could go on. So yeah, it sounds like proper business investigative journalism, and and it's not easy. Some of the things you're trying to cover. How do you actually go around finding the information? Because I'm sure you can't find everything online, and I'm sure not everyone is willing to talk. But I can imagine you've got your hands full, trying to source and trying to gather all that information, right, for these different topics.
Absolutely. Well, we're only as good as our sources. And like I say, everybody in this industry, because they're all essentially working for the same goal, to see the industry flourish, they're really open and willing to be frank with you and, tell you if business isn't going well, tell you the reasons they think why. So just building relationships is a big part of it, trying to, just kind of keep on an even keel, and I guess not in people's good books, because if you're writing a critical piece you can't always do that, but just be as fair as possible. But other sources, lots of investment firms, legal firms are always very useful, because the regulation is so complex. Okay. You can't be an expert in every single field. God knows I've tried. So it's, people that can kind of explain situations to you are essential as well. And then sort of pestering official state departments, okay, really is a big part of my day as well. Freedom of information requests, things like that, and cottoning on to when something has been released. Hundreds and hundreds of Google alerts helps.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Amazing. Yeah, and then of course in Europe, each country they are kind of doing their own thing, CBD, medical cannabis, and then recreational. So there's like you said, you're sort of trying to get it all down chronologically, and it's I can imagine there's a lot of work behind that. But great. Well, let's move on to the hot, juicy topic of JuicyFields. Like you said, everyone in the industry is very welcoming and is open arms. Maybe not quite JuicyFields. So this has been the big topic of late, and perhaps before we actually talk about the latest and I guess one of the largest scandals in the European industry, in the cannabis industry, maybe first, for all our listeners who may not know, maybe you could tell us what JuicyFields is, or was, I should say.
Yeah, well, they claim to still be a company that is... I think so, that is coming back. So we'll come on to that. But JuicyFields was a crowd investment or crowd growing sort of retail investment firm. I think the concept initially was that you would invest money either in Bitcoin or through bank transfer into a number of seeds or plants. They, through their partnerships with legitimate companies, they did have these partnerships and they did grow these plants. You grow 6 plants, say, and they will then sell that to pharmaceutical, medical cannabis suppliers, give you back the profits, sort of promising, I think, up to 60% profits. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of people did see profits, from what I'm told. A lot of people invested and saw initial profits for about 2 years, I think, before they basically were locked out of their accounts overnight. Excuse me.
Okay.
So yeah, I hadn't actually really come across JuicyFields. I was aware of their name. I didn't know an awful lot about them before sort of mid last month, when we started getting a lot of red flags about them and a lot of people telling us something's going quite horribly wrong. But they had a fairly notorious relationship within the industry already. They were kind of seen as, if not entirely dodgy and stay away from, and a kind of working in a grey area, shoving a lot of money into marketing in such amounts that it was kind of becoming suspicious. So I think some people will tell you that they knew from day one they were a scam, that their model never worked, that, anybody who'd done 10 minutes of due diligence would have known immediately they're a scam, to people who think they're kind of were legitimate people, they were a legitimate company, they've been taken over by bad actors, and everywhere in between.
Okay.
So, and the jury's
still out.
I think in terms of the, from what we're hearing from investors, the jury is still out. But I think it's incredibly difficult to think they are anything other than one of the biggest scams we've seen in the last decade.
Yeah, I mean, it's called the largest Ponzi scheme, in cannabis history, isn't it, really? So, and there's rumors about that it has all the hallmarks of the Russian mafia. But, I mean, I'm sure there's all sorts of rumors going around.
Yeah, so this that's what we reported on recently. So this was coming from a guy called Lars Olofsson, who is a lawyer building a
case.
Yes, so I'm just trying to think of the word for a large case with lots of people. He has he's representing about 350 investors now.
Okay.
So
lawsuit.
Yes, yeah, a giant lawsuit. And big shout out to Lars. Really, is
he Scandinavian?
He's Swedish.
Swedish, okay, yeah.
And his business partner Nina. They run a law firm called Prio Startup, and they, from what I understand, kind of specialize in these very complex international scams. They've been doing this for 10 years and have kind of built almost a framework for how these scams work, having dealt with so many of them. And from what they have told me, from all the bank details and things that they've seen and all the people they've spoken to, which is, now in the thousands, they are, Lars says he's 100% sure this is the Russian mafia. This bears all the hallmarks of a Russian mafia scam. It's kind of, some of the correspondence they were putting out are almost copy and paste from other scams that they've been dealing with. And they don't see that there's any other possible way this could be anything other than a Russian mafia scam. But yeah, as you say, there's a lot of conflicting information out there. It's very hard to find anything at all that's you can corroborate.
No, I'm sure that's the way they want it as well.
Absolutely,
scammers. Yeah, great. And I mean, so it was kind of an investment platform. It was a service, basically, for investors, or I think they called it e-growers, who could participate in the cultivation, harvesting and sale of cannabis plants. So it was kind of from seed to shelf. And it was promising really, really good, too good to be true returns. I mean, that should already be the first alarm bell, right? If your returns are that good, that should raise an eyebrow or two. And I'm sure it did for some people.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, a key thing about these sort of scams is that it actually sounds like a very good idea. Obviously they're
on paper, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because growing plants, although growing cannabis is a bit different, there's a lot of often you need a facility, you need all the security and stuff that comes along with it. But,
GMP, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's an awful lot. But if you already have that sort of setup ready to go, the theory that you could buy hire a bit of that space, grow plants, sell it, to a layman investor or someone like me who doesn't understand the really in-depth ins and outs of just how difficult that is to kind of do in practice, and take into all the considerations of cross-border stuff, having these agreements in place. It's it sounds feasible and it sounds attractive, and I think knowing the idea of growing plants and then seeing how much you can sell medical cannabis for, it sounds plausible and feasible that these returns could be a thing for the kind of uninitiated investor, someone who isn't an expert in the cannabis industry. I think it probably sounded not too good to be true. I think it probably sounded like
attractive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean that's a big part of how these scams work. There is an element of believability to them.
Yeah. No, of course. And well, that's what, to reel you in, right? They wouldn't. And do you know how many people actually signed up to the platform? I mean, I read somewhere that they claimed they had almost 500,000 or about 500,000 users from mainly Europe and Latin America, if I understand correctly. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think their website stated 500,000. I think there's some other quotes of around that or even higher, some saying 1 million. From what I've heard, it's anywhere between sort of 50,000 to about 120,000. That, but it's very difficult because a lot of these investors were using Bitcoin, were perhaps investing in something they almost knew wasn't quite right, and maybe using funds that weren't 100% legitimate or sort of existed in a grey area.
We'll test the waters with this illegitimate fund.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And so don't want to come forward and say, okay, I've lost a load of money here, because they don't want stuff traced. It's the nature of these sort of things. It's so difficult to pin a real number, and until there's a massive international effort with lots of government departments and masses of resources, which, judging by recent developments, it looks like there may never be. I don't think we'll ever know for sure.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions a bit later down the line. Do we know who did it? Well, we talked a bit about maybe the Russian mafia, and will they be caught? But probably not. These sort of scams often the perpetrators tend to get away with it, right? So they're so far away from the action, from everything that happened. A quick question. So, I mean, anyone could invest, right? So, I mean, let's say I was a potential investor who was considering using JuicyFields services. Do you know, how did the platform work, and what did the process look like? For example, was there a minimum or a maximum investment cap?
Yeah, so I think they said overall that I think it was 180 grand was the top cap. Someone may correct me there. I think the model was that you couldn't invest more than $4,500 or euros at a time.
Right.
They put a cap on it there, and I think there was some limits on how much you could do, which, to their credit, made a lot of people think, okay, this seems legitimate. It means that we can't go mad on this. People can't invest millions and millions and kind of take it over. But the crux of it is that they allowed you to set up as many accounts as you wanted. Yeah. So you could
do it anyway.
Absolutely, and that's what most people did. And there was no stop to that. Pretty much no background checks. You didn't really have to provide them any information or details other than signing up your email address and pretty much going ahead with it and sending them your money.
So it sounds like there could have been quite a few dodgy investors in there who ended up working with a dodgy company there as well, or dodgy stock, I should say.
I think so, but I think it's a difficult one because it's not criminal to be naive. I think it's hard to pinpoint everybody as kind of while there almost certainly was bad actors and people who knew this was a bit in a bit of a grey area. There was probably an awful lot of people who thought this was legit and have lost lots of money and are definitely victims. And then, it comes down to who's really culpable here. Is it obviously the scammers who, as you mentioned, kind of will never be caught. I think Lars was telling me in his 10 years of doing this,
Wow.
I think one, if not none at all, of the cases that have gone to court have ever seen anybody go to jail. It's just so difficult to prosecute these people. And to come back to your last question slightly, I saw very recently, just had an email through, that the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, so the UK's kind of anti-fraud organisation, have been telling investors that they can't pursue this case. I think verbatim quote is they've not been able to identify a line of inquiry that they can pursue. Okay. So it's just the nature of these scams being so complex, so sophisticated, and so fast moving, and across so many countries, that law enforcement just has such a hard time being able to do anything. It's not that they're not willing. It's not that they kind of almost don't know how, but it's just this is so complex and so difficult that they basically say, I'm sorry, we can't do anything. Mm-hmm. So then it comes down to, who can you target? Who is complicit? Who saw this and looked the other way and allowed this to happen? And I think really that's what, as an industry, we need to look at and do a lot of kind of introspection as to how this was allowed to happen in both cannabis, and I think there's also a lot to be said for the kind of crypto world, because that was a big part of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the crypto world, that's a whole different thing. But yeah, for the cannabis industry, hopefully it's a cautionary tale, right, moving forward. But do you think it might have, what implications do you think this whole Juicy Fields episode might have on the cannabis industry as a whole?
It's very hard to say. I think, as you say, it's a cautionary tale. I think that companies within the sector may look a little bit harder and do a little bit more due diligence when working with companies in future, hopefully. But I think really the big story, or the big thing we need to look at, is education. There are so many people that, as I mentioned, kind of had some indication or strong idea that these guys weren't what they said they were, but didn't really speak out and say anything, certainly to investors. And, the media on our side, this was... numerous people I've spoken to, including people that are listed on the website as JuicyFields partners, who did legitimately grow for them, thought they were a legitimate business, did their due diligence, but saw that in the media they had really glowing write-ups from I have to be very careful not to mention anybody by name, but glowing reviews from very respectable publications, which, to them said, okay, they must be legitimate. This must be the real thing. So, and the same with the companies that had them as sponsors, all the really legitimate, the kind of gold standard for cannabis conferences and organizations bringing people together and doing really good work. Having them on the bill, just for people questioning them slightly, that would sway them, and that's a big part of it. So I think, really taking the time to look a little bit deeper into perhaps some mistakes that were made there on the part of the whole industry. As I say, the media side of it is a big part, and in partnerships as well.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, there's just so many layers to this scandal, so many directions. So it's hard to know what will affect what and, in which sector as well. But it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting what you say about the media playing its own role. I mean, both you and I, we're in cannabis media. So, we're all to blame to a degree. But at least now we're shedding some light on the whole thing as well. But yeah, I mean, for me, the first I heard of JuicyFields was at Spanibus, right? So I was at Spanibus this year in March, and I saw that they were one of the big sponsors. And I hadn't heard of them before, and I also checked out. I also thought these returns seem, again, a bit too good to be true. But what threw me off a little bit was actually their logo, because I saw their logo and I was like, okay, they're a huge company throwing money everywhere. But this logo is almost identical to like a generic logo, I think, on Canva, which is an easier version of Photoshop. So it was funny for me. It was actually the design aspect where I thought, like, that's strange, big company, but using ripping off a logo. So that already threw me off. I didn't know why, but that was my alarm bell. Fortunately, I didn't go into it. But like you said, there were a lot of innocent people that invested into it. Stocks is always if anyone has a little bit of extra change, a lot of people are interested in investing into stocks. And then of course if you have an interest in cannabis as well, in the industry and all that, I mean, you put the two together, I'm sure a lot of people will, find it a very attractive prospect or attractive investment to get into.
Yeah, and that's really the saddest part about it, because the cannabis industry is dying for investment at the moment. We've really
left, right, and center, right?
Absolutely, it really needs investors to get on board, and
so this doesn't help at all, does it?
No, not at all. And same for a lot of the companies that worked alongside them. Regardless of the due diligence kind of argument, everybody really needs money, especially right now. So when a company comes along that looks fairly legitimate and says, look, we'll sponsor you to do this event, it's going to be attractive. And I think it doesn't help that the cannabis sector right now, or for the last 2 years, and continues to be, not least because of the cost of living crisis, but because how certainly in Europe, kind of investment and the financial world is kind of structured against it to a large extent. The money's a really big side of it, and if they're throwing it around, as you say, fairly willy-nilly, I think regardless of how many really legitimate people took them on, there will always be someone that would have taken this money. So I think it was almost not unavoidable. Obviously, there were mistakes made, and more the industry could have done to ward off investors, but it is just so ripe for opportunity for scammers. And this, it doesn't help the investment case in cannabis, which otherwise should be very attractive.
Yeah, I guess what's so surprising is the sheer scale of it, So, and then I guess what you're saying from an investment point of view, it maybe has tarnished the industry a little bit, or set it back slightly, or created some trust issues there, So it didn't help push things forward. That's for sure. But no, sorry, go on.
No, I was just about to say that. Yes, it probably will put a lot of people off who are otherwise wary, because I think one of the big issues with cannabis investment is the barrier to entry is so tough, because there's so much you kind of have to understand. There's so many complex regulatory things. So that's why things like JuicyFields are so attractive, because they cut out having to learn all that. They say, we'll just take your money, we'll grow it, we'll sell it, we'll give it back to you. You don't have to worry about all this other stuff.
A few clicks of the button, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's other legitimate things like ETFs. They're starting to pop up now, which is when you invest in a kind of group of stocks. And
ETFs, you said?
Yes, ETFs.
Okay. Oh, CTFs, sorry. Mm-hmm.
And don't necessarily have to worry about the individual performance of each of these companies. So, there are ways around it, but I think, as I say, a big problem for investment is the high barrier to entry, and I think this has made it even higher.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so how do you think they managed to actually get away with it for so long? Because, I mean, they were established in 2020, and as you mentioned, it was only very recently that, everything's sort of come to light, that it's a big scam or a Ponzi scheme, so to speak. How do you think they actually managed to get away with it for so long?
Well, from what I understand, until this all started happening, people were legitimately getting returns.
Yeah.
So, I think regardless of what people think, if they're making money off it, they're probably a lot more willing to look the other way. I think there's also the point we made earlier that they put so much into marketing, certainly targeting influencers and things like that, so that they are constantly kind of being covered on YouTube or on Instagram and by, investment or business influencers who, by the way, are victims. They are probably not complicit. They didn't. Probably don't do due diligence. It's not part of their game.
Yeah.
So the fact that it was just constantly out there and just seemed like a legitimate company made a lot of people just look the other way. This seems to be a core part of how these scams work, throwing so much money at marketing that it just whitewashes everything. You hear about them so much. There is so much conflicting information that even now it's so hard to pinpoint exactly what was going on and what happened. So
and who's responsible?
Absolutely. So people, just give up, they burn out and say, okay, I'm making money. This is fine.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. I mean, okay, great. Well, I mean, I think that I think that pretty much covers the the late. I mean, is there anything new that's come to surface? I mean, it feels like every day they're still sort of discovering new, but I feel like we've kind of painted a picture of JuicyFields and the scandal it was, or is, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I'd really want to get out there is that they are still trying to convince people that this isn't a scam, that they're getting their money back. I've heard people refer to it as JuicyFields 2.0. Now they've just put out a new investment prospectus for a new platform from supposedly all the good directors who were at JuicyFields at the time. And I think it's very important to say to people to be incredibly cautious and, really probably stay away from JuicyFields until, for sure that they're not basically a scam, which I think at this point is pretty much impossible. And to be very, very skeptical of any correspondence that comes out of the company, because even if they were legitimately people that worked there and had the best of intentions, as a director, if you kind of didn't do your own due diligence in the company you're working for to see that there was these massive loopholes in not only the financial kind of workings, but the big grey areas in which they were operating and the big promises they made that they definitely couldn't keep, and the fact that there were so many red flags all along the whole cycle. Even if they were there under the best intentions, you have to question whether they had the best judgment.
Yeah. They're actually good at what they do then, in that sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the other point to make in terms of kind of where this story is going and where investors or victims, whichever you'd like to refer to them as, should kind of focus on either getting justice. I think it's probably a lost cause to expect that they'll ever get their money back, from what I'm told. Certainly Bitcoin is gone, but the banks are pretty much flat out refusing to take any action on this.
Okay.
And from what I've heard from Lars, they are who he's going after. This case is focusing squarely on the banks as a complicit actor in this. Okay. And that while law enforcement is kind of has their hands tied in what they can do retrospectively, the amount of transactions that took place that should have been red flagged and should have been noted as fraudulent, not legitimate, or at least suspicious, and that weren't flagged, there is something either wrong with the system, or there was something wrong at the financial institutions that allowed this to happen, with close possibly to $1 billion euros lost.
That's what I was going to say. We still don't, that was going to be my question. I didn't actually ask how much money did they get away with it. So the estimates that it might be close to $1 billion.
Yeah,
wow.
Estimates. So that's so Lars, based on figure from the bank transfers that he's seen from the investors that he's spoken to, he says anywhere between around 700 million euros, no less than 500. We've seen estimates from sources who are kind of tracking the movements of the Bitcoin and stuff, and the movement of the wallets is close to $1 billion. Again, it's so hard to pinpoint. It's probably a figure that we'll never know.
Okay.
But it sounds far-fetched to say $1 billion lost, but it looks like it could legitimately be close to it.
Wow. I mean, that is, again, the sheer scale of this this scandal, I think, is what's shocked so many people, and hopefully has created a bit of a ripple effect, and we'll see we'll see how how investors, how the industry picks itself up from this. But yeah, with all the red flags also, it's that didn't get picked up. It's interesting how it was allowed to last so long as well. So
absolutely. And the different sort of barriers that should have been there that failed. In not only in the cannabis industry, in the financial industry, as I say, in the media, in Bitcoin and crypto, and in investment in general. I think there's lessons to be learned for a lot of people here.
Yeah, absolutely. And just also from a non-business perspective, I mean, again, when I talk to a lot of my guests, a big part of moving this industry forward is getting rid of the stigma that's still attached with cannabis. So, of course, a big scandal like this doesn't help that cause either. And you also said before that a key factor to move the industry forward in the right direction is education as well, right? So something like this, well, again, hopefully we can repurpose this scandal as a cautionary tale, and then moving forward, show people what you should and should not, and more importantly, what you should not do as well. And actually, I've only got 2 more questions for you, which I ask all my guests, and this is actually leading on nicely to one of them. And that is, what advice would you give to an entrepreneur, British entrepreneur, European entrepreneur, who's thinking about entering the cannabis space? So I guess one thing you'll say is be careful what you invest in, but yeah.
Yeah, that would be the first. They're like any other business, do your due diligence, make sure you have a good idea about what they actually do. But I think, if they're the first coming into it, as I mentioned, things like ETFs is quite a safe bet in terms of you don't have to worry quite so much about the ins and outs of strategy and regulation. But, it's a really fascinating field. And if, the reason there's so much excitement about cannabis is because it's just waiting to explode. So there's so much opportunity for businesses and investors to make a lot of money eventually. So I would say, it's worth learning about. It's worth getting up to scratch on the sort of issues facing the cannabis industry. And knowing what the markers are that things are starting to change. And I'd say a lot of that is already happening across Europe. So, do your reading, educate yourself. But, there is a lot of reason to be optimistic and to think that, this will soon be an industry where you can probably make some money.
Yeah, interesting. Well, good piece of advice. But it also makes me think, like, it's interesting what you said. I also feel there's a lot of opportunity to be had. Like, this industry is going to explode, like you said, but we're still struggling with investors, right? You'd think opportunity, investment, go hand in hand, but there is still some work to be done there, in the middle to sort of make that happen, that synergy. Great. Well, I mean, the last question I have for you, which I ask all my guests, is if you could go back in time, is there anything you would do differently?
In my life or in my cannabis life?
So actually, that's interesting. So my guests have interpreted the question differently. So my initial, the question initially meant was, if you go back in your own lifetime, is there anything you would do differently? But some people have also taken that question as a bit more general. If they could go back in any time in history and change one thing, what would it be? So I actually leave it up to you. You can answer that question and interpret it any way you want. Wow.
Okay, that's a big question. I would probably go back to school and study a little bit harder in music and some other subjects that probably would have made getting to where I am now a much easier ride. So go to school, kids. And
go to school.
Yeah.
Education, right? That's what we said. That's what we said. Nice. And just off topic, off cannabis and everything. So what as a fellow musician, what instrument is? Are you a bassist then?
Yeah, that's 2 basses, both of which I built.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah. So I an aspiring luthier and guitar builder, and bass player.
Oh, amazing. Well, you know what they say, it's all about the beat and the bass. So
absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah.
Great. So, I mean, where can a little off a side note there. Hopefully there's a few fellow musicians in our listeners. So where can our guests find out more about you and BusinessCann?
So we have a number of companies. So BusinessCann is where I work, and we cover European news. We also have Business of Cannabis, which is under our sort of media umbrella that focuses on the North American markets. Then we have Prohibition Partners, who are kind of the industry standard for industry reporting and industry predictions and statistics and things like that. And we have Cannabis Europa, who is a big cannabis conference and event in
London.
Europe. Yes, and we have an event coming up in New York soon, Business of Cannabis New York. And as you mentioned, Cannabis Europa London and across Europe as well. So across all of those brands, and also Atalis, which is an upcoming e-commerce platform, B2B e-commerce platform in the cannabis industry. So we're all under the same umbrella. We're all one team. And if you go across one, you'll be able to come across the rest of us. So check them all out.
Okay, great stuff. Great. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time to come on the show. It was an absolute pleasure having you. And thank you for letting me discuss JuicyFields with you. You know, definitely it was very, very interesting. And yeah, like we said, hopefully it is a cautionary tale and not too much more. So, yeah.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. And I'm sure we'll be in touch soon.
So that was Ben Stevens, the chief editor at BusinessCann. I just wanted to thank him again for taking the time to come on the show and shed some light on this whole JuicyFields scandal. Do make sure to check out the BusinessCann website and read some of their articles if you want to stay updated on all things cannabis and business related in Europe. The website is businesscann.com. That's BusinessCann.com. You can also check out prohibitionpartners.com if you want to find out what else these guys are up to. Also, make sure to check out our website at smellslikebusiness.com and subscribe to this podcast if you like what you hear. I've been your host, Tom. Have a green day.
Smells like business.